Welcome back to another AP US History video lecture, and this time we're going to talk about American foreign policy, or what oftentimes is called American imperialism in the late 1800s. So how do we get there? You might remember at the beginning of the class, more near the beginning of the year, we talked about how American foreign policy back in the 1820s and 1830s started off with Washington's foreign policy, and that was really neutrality. And keep in mind the reason for that at the time. So at the time, the country is very limited in size. It's not really connected as of yet to international trade at the level that it will be later on. And at that time, really, there was no professional army or navy. That's why Washington claims, we got to stay out of these foreign alliances, especially when we were talking at that time of the Quasi-War and the Napoleonic Wars. In 1820, that starts to change. President James Monroe gives the Monroe's Doctrine, in which he establishes this principle of American leadership. He says, hey, look, from here on out, if you want to go into the Western Hemisphere, you have to go through America first. Then in the 1830s, America starts to expand. With Manifest Destiny, America starts to make the argument that really our culture, our government, our economic system should be the model for the entire Northern Hemisphere. So because of that, there really is this argument that within the Western and Northern Hemisphere, America is going to start to expand outwards. That continues. In 1854, Commodore Perry was going to go over to Japan and force them to open up to international trade. And then in 1866, the Secretary of State, William Seward, got the U.S. to buy Alaska. Now, at the time, it was called Seward's Folly. But eventually, we found out actually it was a pretty good move. There was a huge amount of oil that would be found within Alaska. So what's my thesis? Overall here, what I'm going to argue is that American industrialization in the late 1800s, so 1875 on out, creates the conditions for American expansion into a more global role due to the problem of what's called overproduction. Okay, so let's talk about industrialization and this problem of overproduction. In 1875 on out, we have a massive growth in the industrial economy, and it leads to a problem called overproduction. So what is that? What it means is, remember, the Industrial Revolution was about mass producing goods. Overproduction was the problem when too many goods were created and there weren't large enough markets of consumers to buy them. So America started looking outwards to see if it could find people who would do this. And it found that China would be a really good goal for us. A huge amount of people in that area. At that time, it was 200 million. You think today about 2 billion people. That's a huge marketplace for us to sell our goods. Now, at the time, some theories were being developed about how to develop this international trade. One of them was by an admiral named Alfred T. Mahan. Mahan argued for a theory on the Navy, in which he argued that the Navy was the basis to American military efforts in the future, and in many ways he's turned out to be right. His argument really was that if we had a strong naval battleship system, that would allow us then to create basically stepping stones across the world in which we would have different places where ships would stop off and then protect trade and protect American interests. And the first one really that was looked at was the island of Hawaii. So at the time, there was a McKinley tariff that had lifted tariffs on Cuba. A bunch of American settlers who had gone out to Hawaii really wanted Hawaii then to join up with the United States, so that way they would no longer have to deal with the tariff competition with Cuba. So he started making the argument that the U.S. should just come in and take over Hawaii. Well, at the time, the president was President Cleveland, and he argued we can't do something like that. That would be violating the Kingdom of Hawaii, who was led at the time by Queen Liliuokalani. He argued this would be violating their sovereignty. It goes against our basic belief systems. It was only 100 years ago that we had the American Revolution calling for the need for local sovereignty. Well, that was going to change with the next president. President James McKinley argued, we can forget about that, because Hawaii would be a great stepping stone on our way out to China. And so because of that, McKinley sent in the Marines. They took over Hawaii. Hawaii became a part of the United States, and tariffs were lowered, and now Hawaii became a part of the U.S. economic system. Now, at the same time, the Secretary of State, John Hay, was leading an effort called the Open Door Policy, which was meant to open up China to zones of trade. So, at the time, everybody wanted to get into China because it was a huge marketplace. And the fear was we would have a huge global war in China over these trade areas. So, John Hay led the effort to establish this Open Door Policy. Well, what is this? The idea was to split up China into different trade zones. Each trade zone would trade with one European or North American area. So, like, for example, you might have one area trading with Britain, one with France, one with the United States, one with Russia, one with Japan. Now, overall, you might think China would benefit out of this. the most, that gets to trade with everybody. But in many ways, what the purpose of this was, and what ended up here, was that each major European and United States country was able to do was to have a part of China, a massive part, for their trade zones. And then all of this was justified by social Darwinism. So in the United States, the main figure for this was Josiah Strong, who led the belief that the United States was racially superior and therefore in the position to civilize the rest of the world. Okay, that leads up to, in the mid-1890s, the Spanish-American War. So right after we took over Hawaii, America reinstituted tariffs on Cuba. It was the Wilson-Gorman tariff. This led to a massive recession in Cuba. Cubans then rebelled against the Spanish, who had controlled Cuba up until this time. At that point, America really was not ready to get into this war. In fact, most Americans looked at this war and said that while they had empathy for the Cubans, it reminded them only 100 years earlier of throwing off the British. At the same time, America was not going to intervene in somebody else's fight. But there were a number of things that led into our entrance into the war. First off, information started coming out about a man named General Valeriano Weyler, who was a Spanish general who had set up re-concentration camps in which he was holding people who had been captured during the war. Now, this was kind of normal, and of course there were abuses and there were problems in these camps. That was normal for a wartime. But what happened was newspapers kind of played up the issue and made it appear that General Weyler was really setting up some pretty horrible camps and that people there needed protection. The next one, though, was the explosion of the Maine. So the American battleship, the Maine, was in Havana Harbor and at one point exploded. And the argument made in a lot of newspapers was that this was probably the Spanish who had done this. They had probably mined the harbor. We now know today what actually happened. There was a report done on this in the early 1970s in which they went back and studied the remains of the Maine. And what they found was there was an internal explosion inside one of the boiler rooms, and that's what caused the Maine to explode. Now, you might say, well, how are they supposed to know about that back then? You'd be right. But what that's missing is the issue of yellow journalism. So yellow journalism was a type of journalism, and it was used by two men, William Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and their idea was they could sell papers by really exaggerating issues, take a little bit of the truth and exaggerate issues. A good example of this was a quote from William Hearst, in which one of his reporters went to Cuba and said, "There's really no story here." And Hearst said, "You give me a story, I'll give you a war." The last thing really, though, that got America into the war was something called the Delome letter. This was a letter that was intercepted and sent over to James McKinley. And what it was the Spanish ambassador, Delome, basically called James McKinley spineless and said he would never get involved in this war. And we might as well just do whatever we can in Cuba because America's never going to take the risk. And if we just go and get ourselves settled in there, by the time we're in there, America won't be able to do anything. That finally pushed McKinley into getting into the war. The war lasted for 16 weeks. It included Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. In fact, at one point in our Navy, Admiral Dewey was sent out to the Philippines in order to help a local rebel named Emilio Aguinaldo to rebel against the Spanish. Now, at the end of the war, Emilio Aguinaldo said, "Thank you so much. Thank you for helping America. Now, if you could please leave, we want to run ourselves." At which point, McKinley said, "Well, hold on 1 second." And he claimed in front of Congress that one night when he was going through the White House, he all of a sudden, and I'm not making this up, this is literal, had a vision from God in which God told him, "You got to go in and you got to occupy the Philippines." Why? Because the Philippines are going to be taken over by the Germans or by the French or by the Russians. So it's up to you to go in and to civilize them. Well, this eventually led to a war between the Filipinos and the U.S. Marines, and that went on for 2 years. 2 million Filipinos were killed, and eventually America did occupy the Philippines. So to give a good example of what happened here in the Philippines, I want to use President Taft. At the time, Taft was a civil bureaucrat who was rising up through the ranks. He wasn't president quite yet, and he was sent over in order to rebuild the Philippines. And he literally said, this is a literal quote, when he went over to the Philippines, he said, "It's good that the United States is here, because we are here to help out our little brown brothers." Yep, that was an example of the type of social Darwinist thinking for that time period. Now, something similar was going on with Cuba as well. In Cuba, at the beginning of the war, the Teller Amendment was passed, promising Cubans their sovereignty, and the U.S. would not get involved. By the end of the war, the US Congress passed the Platt Amendment, in which America gave itself the right to get involved in Cuban affairs if there was an emergency. In Puerto Rico, America would pass the Four-Acre Act, in which they claimed that Puerto Rico would be not a state, but a territory of the United States, which has continued up until today. Okay, at the end of the war, the next president, who was vice president at the time for James McKinley, was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had fought in the Spanish-American War with the Rough Riders, and he would add on to American foreign policy with something called the Roosevelt Corollary. The corollary was meant to add on to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine had really been a defensive policy in which America claimed that it would be the leader of the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary said the United States could get involved in the Western Hemisphere when our interests were involved. Okay, let's give an example of this. At the time, there had been a desire to create a canal that would connect up the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. The first country to try to do this was the French, and they had a variety of different areas. One of the biggest areas that they tried to do this was in Nicaragua. The problem had been that the Nicaraguan government was not very amenable to this. There had also been a volcanic eruption in the area. So eventually the United States wanted to take this over, and they wanted to move this to Panama. The problem at the time, Panama didn't really exist. It was a part of Colombia. So there had been a treaty passed in the 1850s called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. It promised no external interference. Now, at the time, what they meant by that was no external interference, meaning European countries. So Roosevelt would use the U.S. Navy to stop the Colombians from putting down a Panamanian rebellion. His hope was the Panamanians would get to rebel, and after they rebelled, they would become independent. And at that point, Roosevelt would be able to use that area for the Panama Canal, which is exactly what happened. Another example of where U.S. started to get more of a leadership role in the world was with the Russo-Japanese War. At the end of this war, both sides asked Teddy Roosevelt to negotiate it, and he did. He led the Portsmouth Treaty, in which he negotiated between the two countries. Final example that I want to bring up of U.S. leadership at this time is called the Gentleman's Agreement. Here, Roosevelt was asked to intervene to stop Japanese immigration into California. So what he did was he made an agreement with the Japanese in which he would allow Japanese immigrants who had come to California to have their full rights, but no more immigration from Japan after that. And then intentionally he sailed what was called the Great White Fleet to Japan in order to send a message of power to them. Okay. Okay, what are our takeaways from this? So number one, I would argue, imperialism by America was driven by the need to find new markets abroad for industrialization and to stop the problem of overproduction. Number two, the justification for all this was based upon both military and racial hierarchies, social Darwinism. And number three, the effect was an American global foreign policy that was based upon now a new leadership of economic and political power interests. Okay, see you in class.